For a period of 3 months, starting in December 1715, the Wesley family heard a number of strange sounds and witnessed numerous accounts of what they believed was a ghost named Old Jeffrey. Today we're going to explore these strange accounts reported by the Wesleys and the people who lived and worked in their home. The haunting of the old rectory at Epworth is considered to be one of the most famous poltergeist cases in British history. It has been called the Epworth phenomena. So join us on this spooky episode of the Methodical Methodist podcast as we explore the legend of Old Jeffrey. Hey everybody, and welcome to the Methodical Methodist podcast. I am your host, the Reverend Andrew Lay, and if you like the show, I hope that you might take a minute to subscribe, rate, and write a review for the podcast. It helps to boost the show and make it to where more people can find it. You can also find me on Facebook at facebook.com/methodicalpod, and you can also find me on Instagram as well. My handle is @methodicalpod, so be sure to check me out. In 1714, when John Wesley was only a boy of 11 years old, he left home and started attending the Charterhouse School in London. About the same time, while he was away, a series of strange events took place back home at the Epworth Rectory. On December 1st, 1715, the Wesleys' parlor maid, Nanny Marshall, claimed that she heard a strange and terrible noise in the house. She claimed to hear sounds like the dismal groans of a man and the pains of dying. Susanna and her daughters were skeptical. They thought it was just a story of girlish imagination. But only a few days later, two of the Wesley sisters, Suki, who was 21, and Anne, who was 14, heard something rush by the outside of the house, followed by 3 knocks, then repeated 3 times inside. They heard a series of repeated and methodical knocking on the doors and paneling all over the house. Molly Wesley, who was only about 20 years of age, was sitting in the dining room reading. All of a sudden, she heard what sounded like the door that led into the hall open and a person walking in. The person seemed to have on a silk nightgown that was rustling and trailing along the floor. It seemed to walk around her, then to the door, then to come back and walk around her again, but she couldn't actually see a person. She thought, it signifies nothing to run away, for whatever it is, it can run faster than me. So she rose, she calmly put her book under her arm, and walked slowly away. After supper, Molly was sitting with her sister Suki, about a year older than her, and she was telling her what had happened. And she kind of made light of it, and she told her, well, I wonder why you're so easily frightened. I would fain to see what would fright me. But suddenly, they heard a knock sound from under the table. She took the candle and looked, but neither of them could find anything. Then the window and a warming pan, which was a device that was made to warm beds, began to clatter. Next, the latch on the door moved up and down a number of times without anybody moving it. So Suki jumped up out of bed. She pulled the bed sheets over her head, cowered down, and didn't look up until the next morning. Then, just 2 nights later, Amelia, who was 23, thought she heard the sound of several bottles being broken and a large lump of coal being dumped onto the kitchen floor. And when she examined the kitchen, however, she found no evidence of broken glass or pieces of coal. There was nothing there. On another occasion, a young boy who lived in the house and did manual labor for the Wesleys heard someone walking up and down the stairs with a long cloak and gobbling like a turkey. He also claimed that he saw something that looked like a rabbit run out of a hole in the copper, spin around 3 times, and run off, and it eluded his attempts to catch it. At first, Susanna Wesley wrote these reports off, saying it was probably just neighbors playing pranks. She thought it might have been rats. She kept attempting to shrug off whatever noises they heard and make excuses for what those noises might have been. Her daughters begged her not to antagonize the ghost, and it wasn't long before Susanna Wesley herself began to hear some strange sounds. The noises and disturbances began to appear during the day as well as the night. Soon the Wesley girls were hearing sounds of breaking glass, footsteps on the landings, and they too heard someone gobbling like a turkey. The Wesley family began to believe that the strange sounds were the work of a ghost named Jeffrey, a local man who had died by suicide. He was a former resident of the home. Samuel and Susanna's daughter Hetty nicknamed the ghost Old Jeffrey. And supposedly, Old Jeffrey took on many different forms. Susanna saw him once as a headless badger-like animal scuttling under the beds. One daughter witnessed a bodiless man's gown clunking behind her in the dark. And one of the strangest reports occurred when a servant, Robert Brown, witnessed the handle of the corn grinding machine begin to turn on its own volition. Brown expressed his regret that old Jeffrey never worked the grinder when it was full. So Brown still had to grind all the corn on his own. But despite all of these noises, Samuel Wesley was completely unaware of these supernatural encounters. For several weeks, Samuel had no idea about the supernatural presence in his house. The Wesley women did not want to tell him at first because first they just assumed that he wouldn't believe them. But then, because the evidence had grown too strong to deny it, they didn't tell him because they thought the spirit had come to harm Samuel. It was common belief back then that spirits did not manifest themselves to the mortal whom they had come on earth to harm. So in other words, Susanna and the Wesley girls feared that Samuel had not witnessed old Jeffrey because old Jeffrey actually intended death and damnation for Samuel. But after a couple of weeks, Samuel began to hear these strange noises himself. And as the women had predicted, he assumed it was just unfriendly neighbors and reports of girlish imagination. In fact, he told his daughter Suki, "I'm ashamed of you. You know, these boys and girls frighten one another, but you are a woman of sense. You should know better." Samuel insisted that if it wasn't the neighbors, then it must have been the lovers of his older daughter sneaking into the house and up to no good. When Samuel heard a report by their servant Robert Brown, who had seen a badger-like creature running out from under his bed, he bought a large mastiff dog named Jack, and he thought that the dog would help with the intrusive vermin and deter pranksters from messing with them. But old Jeffrey began knocking on the walls, and when old Jeffrey would do that, the dog would cringe and whine and attempt to jump up into Robert Brown's bed and take refuge. There's a similar account when Susanna took Amelia into the nursery where she heard noises under the bed, and she saw an animal like a badger without a head run across the room and hide under Amelia's skirts. On another night, Samuel and Susanna were awakened by loud and violent noises. They got up and went throughout the house, but repeatedly the sound seemed to come from the room that they had just left. On another night, Samuel heard rattling among bottles and the sound of several coins being poured out at Susanna's waist and falling down to her feet. Samuel finally started to believe that there was a spirit visiting their home. He feared that this spirit was there to indicate that their son Samuel Jr. in London had died. And so Samuel challenged the spirit, saying, "If thou art the spirit of my son Samuel, I pray thee knock 3 knocks and no more." But there was no response. Samuel and Susanna wrote letters to all their boys, making sure that they were okay. All the Wesley boys who were away at school wrote letters home indicating that yes, indeed, they were alive and well. So Samuel eventually came to the same conclusion that the rest of the family had. Their house was haunted by the spirit of old Jeffrey. On one occasion, Samuel invited a fellow clergyman, the Reverend Joseph Hoole, the vicar from Haxley, to come and spend the night in the house with him. He wanted a witness to hear and a witness to see what the family had been experiencing, to hear these strange encounters. So Wesley and Hoole went through the house together, hearing the usual tappings and knockings, and Samuel was fed up with it. He fired a pistol in the direction of the ghostly noises, calling old Jeffrey a deaf and dumb devil. He then challenged old Jeffrey to join him in his study for some serious conversation about the afterlife. He said, "Don't bother my children. Come to me. I am a man." The spirit, however, did not accept the invitation. But old Jeffrey did immediately respond with the same sequence of knocks that Samuel had used himself to let his wife Susanna know that he was coming home at night. The Wesleys were only met with more disturbances, whistling, lifting latches, opening windows, and brushing against the girls. Susanna Wesley wrote a letter on January 2nd, 1717, describing some of these events in her own voice. One night, it made such a noise in the room over the heads as if several people were walking, then run up and down the stairs, and was so outrageous that we thought the children would be frightened. So your father and I rose and went down in the dark to light a candle. Just as we came to the bottom of the broad stairs, having hold of each other, on my side there seemed as if somebody had emptied a bag of money at my feet, and on his as if all the bottles under the stairs, which were many, had been dashed into 1,000 pieces. We passed through the hall into the kitchen and got a candle and went to see the children. The next night your father would get Mr. Hoole to lie at our house, and we sat together till 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning and heard the knocking as usual. On the next night, Samuel said that when he entered his study, the door was pushed back on him with so much force that it almost knocked him to the floor. He called on his daughter Anne to come stand next to him, and he challenged the spirit to speak, but there was no sound. Samuel then told Anne, "Spirits love darkness. Put out the candle, and perhaps then it will speak." Anne, who was probably scared to death, blew out the candle, and Samuel challenged old Jeffrey to speak again. But again, it was silent. Samuel then said, "2 Christians are an overmatch for the devil. Go downstairs, and it may be when I am left alone, the spirit will speak again." So Anne went downstairs, and Samuel was left alone in his study, but again there was only silence. But then Samuel also claimed to feel someone pressing on his chest later that night when he was laying in bed. And for the next 27 days, there were no noises. But then, it started back up again, all of a sudden. The family were in prayer, and they heard knocks as they were praying for the king. Then at the end of the prayer, when they said amen, there was a loud thump. The next day, Samuel omitted the prayer for the king, and there was no sound. But then the following day, when he mentioned the king again in his prayers, the knocking happened again. And this caused the Wesley family to assume that old Jeffrey was a Jacobite, a supporter of the exiled Stuart King James II. Susanna was so concerned that the poltergeist was going to disturb her evening prayer time that she told old Jeffrey she didn't want to be interrupted between 5 and 6 p.m., and she never was. On one occasion, Samuel's dinner plate began dancing on the table during supper. On several nights, the latch was lifted on the door. Another time, Amelia attempted to hold the latch on the back door of the kitchen, but it was still lifted, and the door was pushed violently against her. A similar thing happened to Samuel 3 times when he was pushed either by a door or an unknown force which drove him against his desk. Strangely enough, the Wesley girls actually didn't seem to be too frightened of old Jeffrey after a while. Perhaps they had grown so used to these strange encounters. After going to bed, the girls would often say, Old Jeffrey is coming. It's time to go to sleep. But there was also a report of the 3 girls in the nursery, and their bed was lifted up to a considerable height. Anne was sitting on the bed and simply said, "Surely old Jeffrey wouldn't run away with me." And that's just, to me, kind of insane that they got so used to these encounters that they would make jokes about it. Susanna Wesley came to believe over time that old Jeffrey was more of a nuisance rather than a threat. And then, after about 3 months, from December 1715, lasting until February 1716, the noises completely stopped. Years later, in 1726, Samuel Jr. and John set out to document all of the details of the supernatural occurrence in their family's home. They compiled letters from their mother, excerpts from their father's journal, and statements from witnesses. The Wesley brothers were completely fascinated by old Jeffrey, and they shared their account of the haunting with anybody who would read it. In their writings, they included this account of a single incident from Samuel's friend, the Reverend Joseph Hoole. One of the maids who went up to sheet a bed brought the alarm that Jeffrey was come above the stairs. We all went up and were standing round the fire in the east chamber. Something began knocking on the other side of the wall of the chimney piece, as with a key. Presently the knocking was under our feet. Mr. Wesley and I went down, he with a great deal of hope, and I with fear. As soon as we left the kitchen, the sound was above us in the room we had just left. Wesley believed that he knew the origins of old Jeffrey. He believed his father had sinned by vowing to ostracize his wife after she refused to pray for the life and health of King William in 1702. John said, "I fear this vow was not forgotten before God." The Wesley family was totally convinced that ghosts really existed, and this was the work of the supernatural spirit, old Jeffrey. There were many who believed that there were explanations for these disturbances. One, Dr. Joseph Priestley, argued that the whole affair was a trick of the servants assisted by some of the neighbors for the purpose of puzzling the family and amusing themselves. They think that maybe Robert Brown and Nanny Marshall were in on it. Still others believe that this may have been the work of the Wesleys' mischievous daughter, Hetty. But there's really not enough evidence to draw any specific conclusions. Dr. Adam Clark, a personal associate of John Wesley, suggested this possible explanation. One night after the family had gone to bed, the maidservant was finishing her work in the back kitchen when she was startled by a noise, looked up, and saw a man working himself through a trough which communicated between the sink stone within a cistern without. Clark goes on to say that the servant struck the escaping intruder on the head, that Samuel shouted and threw the fire irons down the stairs, and the man left a trail of blood for some distance. This suggests that the neighbors were involved in perpetrating the trickery. Another suggestion is that Samuel Wesley had preached a series of sermons against the cunning men in the community, and perhaps all of this work was the work of these cunning men trying to get revenge on the local priest. Perhaps it was the work of the servants, or maybe it was just the neighbors, or maybe, just maybe, it really was the work of old Jeffrey. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Methodical Methodist Podcast. If you have enjoyed this show, I hope you might consider heading on over to iTunes to subscribe, rate, and leave a review of the show. It is very much appreciated. And until next time, stay methodical.